Osumania dan curses are a joke, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that some of the most important and difficult down courses in this game's history were never supposed to be cleared. They were created as absurd challenges, courses that were probably meant to sit at the top forever. But there was one thing nobody really accounted for. There's always someone willing to try, and in Osumania, that was no exception. Systems went from being impossible to becoming goals, then obsessions, and eventually clears. And that cycle repeated itself every single time. So in this video, I want to take you through a small part of the Osumania history. A story where a joke became the symbol of an entire generation of players. A generation that learned how to defeat the impossible, and turned into one of the most ridiculous achievements in recent game history. But before we go any further, we need to understand the concept at the center of the story. What even is Zeta? A lot of you probably already know the answer, but for those who don't, we need to go back in time, back to 2015. In 2015, the first skill measurement system for 4Q Osumania was created. The Osumania 4Key Dan curses. Inspired by a ranking system from other real games such as mania, they were created out of the need for a standardized way to measure a player's skill, and two Geyser Dan curses attempted to fill that role. Each Dan consisted of a series of maps combined into a single challenge, and naturally, the higher the Dan, the harder the maps became. In order to pass them under the official rules, players had to achieve at least 96 overall accuracy across the entire course. This created a new form of competition that will continue evolving throughout the years with the creation of the new Dan curses. As more players started paying attention to these curses, dance slowly became one of the clearest ways for the community to measure real skill. The original dance system was a huge step forward for the community, but as the years went on, people started noticing its flaws. Certain dances were harder than the ones above them, while others contained maps that didn't really teach the skills they were supposed to test. One of the biggest issues was how jugs were handled. Players could climb through most of the system without ever properly learning them, only to suddenly run into them much later at difficulties where they were already expected to be mastered. As more players began using the dance system, it became clear that it needed refinement, and so, in 2017, a new project was born, the Osumania 4Key Dan Reform Project. Created by TD Mythical alongside members of the community, its goal wasn't to replace two Geysers or Yellow Dance, but to improve them. So the maps were re-evaluated, difficulty progression was reworked, and the skills that were introduced more naturally. And for the first time, the dance system began to resemble something closer to a true progression path. Almost 10 years later, many of the courses introduced by the Dan Reform are still used today, and for a huge portion of the community, they became the standard way of measuring real skill in Osumania. To understand why Epsilon mattered so much, you first need to understand how these dances were structured. In the Mythical's reform system, each dan had 4 maps, and they followed the same basic order: a jag map, a technical map, a speed map, and a stamina map. The jag map usually tested repeated nodes and core control. The tech map focused on awkward patterns like mini jag and uncomfortable streams. The speed map pushed fast single streams, for the most part. And the stamina map assessed how long you could keep playing dance patterns without falling apart, such as jump stream or hand stream. So in theory, every dan was trying to test different parts of your raw skill, and as you climb higher, the jumps between each curse became bigger and bigger. The lower dans existed, of course, but for the strongest players, they weren't really the focus of the story. Even Alpha and Beta were already within reach for many good players at this time, and Gamma, while still a serious challenge, was not seen as something completely impossible. Gamma was hard, but it was still manageable. Some of its individual maps already had strong scores, and by 2017, one of them, Break, had even appeared in the finals of the 4Key Mania World Cup. It was a real challenge, but it still felt like something humans were supposed to play. Then came Delta. Delta was different. It was the first dan in the ladder that started to feel genuinely legendary. The jump in BPM, density, and para difficulty was much more serious. Aquarius, the jag map, was faster and harder to control. Crescent Moon had enough technical stamina to fight the rest of your run. Volcanic was extremely tense and dense. And Future Dominators, the final stamina map, was filled with jump streams and very dense hand streams that could easily destroy a run on their nerves. Delta didn't really have one single one like Epsilon will later have with Mario Paint. It was more balanced than that. Depending on the player, some struggled more with Volcanic, others with Future Dominators, and others with the earlier maps, but as a full course, Delta was the first point where the ladder started to feel truly serious. From what I understand, there may have been a Delta clear before a tank, but when it comes to documented clears, a tank was the first one with a clear proof, and Sillyfanger will later become the second documented Delta clear. Even by late 2019, there were still only a handful of documented clears in Delta. And then, above Delta, there was Epsilon. The distance between Delta and Epsilon was ridiculous. Accuracy raw scores made them look like a massive BPM jump on paper, going from 182 to 189 BPM, but the density and patterning made the difference enormous. Forgotten was a completely different nightmare compared to Crescent Moon, filled with speedjack and burst patterns that were extremely difficult to control. And then there was Mario Paint. And after that, Kitsugi to Futago at 320 BPM, even denser, even more stressful, and sitting at the very end of the course. So while Delta felt like the first truly serious wall, Epsilon felt like something outside the skill entirely. That is why, when people talked about the top of the ladder back then, Epsilon wasn't just another step. Delta was the mountain, Epsilon was a joke sitting above it, and that would become the first impossible of this story. And it was within this version of the dance system, with Delta standing as the first truly serious wall, and Epsilon sitting above it like something nobody expected to fall, that I first discovered what impossible looked like. I started playing in 2017, but it wasn't until a few months later that I began discovering what impossible looked like in osumania. Back then, the limits of the game were very different from what we think of today. Looking back now, we have jumped a lot in difficulty, and whenever people talked about impossible scores, one name kept appearing: Atang. He was one of the biggest lions in osumania, especially in 4K. While most players were still trying to understand where the limits of the game were, Atang was already pushing beyond them before he retired completely from playing competitively. For instance, he's the highest ranked player with only 4K maps in osumania history, achieving the most restraining rank in 2018. Okay, let's go back again. In July of 2017, he was posting scores on a dunk course called Epsilon. Now, Epsilon is a name most mania players recognize instantly, because as I've said before, and this is important, Epsilon was still treated more like a joke than a real goal. A collection of absurd maps played at absurd rates, Rose Wars at 1.3 speed, or Kitsugi to Futago at 1.25, and it was just a dance that was meant to be a silly challenge that nobody will clear in the future, and you know how that went. Yet, Atang managed to get an 88% score, and a few days later, he became the first documented player to achieve an A rank on the course. Around that same period, he also became the first documented Delta clear, which makes the constructs even more ridiculous. Today, that may not sound particularly choking. There are plenty of Delta clears and plenty of Epsilon scores. But in 2017, and honestly, even for years afterwards, these scores felt completely inhuman for most of the players that were around for the time. To put it into perspective, when I got my own Delta clear in December in 2018, there were only a handful of documented clears in existence. Back then, players like Atang and City Fanger didn't just play the game. They defined what people thought was possible, and reality is, that really went down for these maps, and that's how it stayed for a long time. The limit of what people considered humanly possible was set firmly at one course: Epsilon. After all, Atang had already achieved an A rank on it, but he didn't seem interested in pushing much farther than that. However, there was someone who decided to fully commit himself to the challenge: Silly Fangirl. He was the second player to seriously pursue an Epsilon clear, although probably not consciously at first, considering that one of his earliest documented scores on the course was only an 87%. But the score itself wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that someone was finally taking Epsilon seriously, if we could call it that. For the first time, Epsilon wasn't just a monument impossibility sitting at the top of the ladder. It was becoming a real goal, and naturally, people started asking the same question: what exactly was supposed to be possible? As City continued improving, more and more players began wondering when Epsilon would finally fall. Maybe in 2020, or maybe in 2021. We were still incredibly far away from the 96 required for a clear. The gap between a tank scores, City scores, and an actual pass felt absolutely enormous. It generally felt like years of progress separated us from that possibility, but despite that, progress was happening. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Yet, with every new score, Epsilon looked a little less impossible than before, and one of the main reasons Epsilon felt impossible was a map called Mario Paint. Mario Paint was the third map of the course, the speed section, and it quickly became infamous amongst anyone who seriously attempted Epsilon. Filled with absurd streams and brutal patterns, it was often responsible for some of the largest accuracy drops during runs from both Atang and Silly Fanger. For a long time, it stayed that way. Mario Paint was, objectively, the hardest map in the entire course. Even future generations of players will continue to regard it as one of the Epsilon's greatest obstacles. At that point, nobody was anywhere close to achieving an S rank on any of the 4 maps that made up the course. But for a brief moment, the impossible stopped being impossible. On June 14th of 2018, during one of his streams, Zeta achieved the first documented death rank of Mario Paint in the map's history.
Holy shit, holy shit! Look this, look this, look what I did. Look what I did. Look what I did, guys.
The score was achieved on OD5 rather than the OD9 version used in the Epsilon itself, but that wasn't the important part. The important part was what it represented. One of the largest barriers standing between players that an Epsilon clear had finally started to crack. In June 2018, will go on to become one of the most important modes in Epsilon's history, because Zeta wasn't the only one making progress. Around the same time, a tank returned from Eternia and began pushing osumania once again. Soon after, he achieved the first documented death rank on an official Epsilon map, Rosewars 1.3, one of the most important maps in the entire course. And the scores kept rising. A tank became the first player to break 92%. Silly followed closely behind with a 91.8%, and in the same session, he will improve his 95 to a 96 score in Mario Paint once again. And for the first time, Epsilon no longer felt infinitely far away. It was still possible, but it no longer felt unreachable. And then, on December 1st, 2018, everything changed again. Zeta achieved the first documented 93% score on Epsilon.
Dude! What the fuck? Holy shit! What?
And to this day, I have still considered it one of the most important scores in Epsilon's history. Not because it was close to a clear, but because it completely changed how people thought about the course. For years, Epsilon had existed as this untouchable challenge sitting above the rest of the game. And suddenly, somebody was only 3 percentage points away from clearing it. It felt enormous for many players, including myself. This was the score that made Epsilon feel real. Not achievable, but real. For the first time, the question wasn't whether Epsilon could be cleared, it was when. We already know Wonder 5193, and if you don't, I highly recommend watching my short about them. In short, by the end of 2018 and throughout 2019, he had become the best 4K player of his era. While Atang and Sillyfinger had stopped deeply pressing an Epsilon clear for various reasons, Wonder decided to take on the possible himself. At the beginning of 2019, he achieved a groundbreaking 98.5% on Delta, a score unlike anything the community had seen before. Throughout the year, he continued posting remarkable achievements, further establishing himself as one of the strongest and most well-rounded players in osumania. Then, on August 22nd, 2019, Wonder uploaded something historic to his YouTube channel. The first documented death rank on Forgotten 1.4, the second map of Epsilon. Suddenly, people started asking the same question. Is this finally the year Epsilon falls? And honestly, it wasn't even an unreasonable question. By that point, 3 of the 4 maps in the course had already been S-ranked, and if anyone seemed capable of putting everything together, it was Wonder. A few days later, on August 31st, he uploaded his first serious Epsilon run, and it looked promising, until Mario Paint happened. After leaving Forgotten with over 94% accuracy, his run collapsed to a devastating 91.95%. Once again, Mario Paint proved to be the course's greatest obstacle. Even Sillyfinger's famous 93 run had struggled on it, and at that point, it was becoming increasingly clear that if Epsilon had a final boss, it wasn't the curse itself. It was Mario Paint, stamina, and nerfs. Now, if you know a little bit about Wonder's history during this period, you will probably know that he was accused of cheating. In response, he hosted what will later become known as the legendary 123 stream, one of the most iconic sessions in osumania history. And during that stream, something happened that confirmed what many people had already started to believe. Epsilon was possible. Wonder produced an incredible run, 95.07 on Rose Quartz, 94.78% on Forgotten. In my opinion, that curse map finally copied used enough, ending at a respectable 93.88%. The result was the first documented 94% on Epsilon. At that moment, it generally seemed inevitable that Wonder will become the first player to achieve an S rank on the course and eventually cleared it, but he stopped. After the 2019 4K World Cup, Wonder gradually disappeared from the spotlight, and by early 2020, he had effectively retired. So, what happened to Epsilon? Cityfanger was barely playing anymore, Atan had largely moved on to Eterna, and Wonder was gone. And that's when one of the players who will push the limits of the possible further than almost anyone else entered the study. Myself. By 2019, I had already become somewhat established within the community, though that's a story for another time. What matters is what came next. By 2020, Epsilon had become a question of when, and not if. The curse hadn't become easier, but after years of progress, it finally became believable. For nearly 3 years, players had pushed the score higher and higher. What started as an 87% score had become a 92% score, then a 93%, and then a 94%. The gap felt impossibly close and impossibly far at the same time, but I knew it could be done. I had already cleared Delta 1.1 a few days before, and I knew the skill level existed, and I also knew that somewhere among us, there was an Epsilon clear waiting to happen. And eventually, it did. On April 10, 2020, after standing unbeaten for almost 3 years, Epsilon was defeated. The first Epsilon clear had finally arrived, and honestly, it felt like a miracle. I was only a few notes away from choking the run completely, but somehow I held on, and that moment became the point where everything changed. Whatever. For 3 years, Epsilon had stood at the top of osumania. A tank, CLA, Wonder, and finally, in April 2020, it had fallen. The impossible had been defeated. Or at least, that's what we thought. After all of that, you might think Epsilon was the end, but it really wasn't. And honestly, it's kind of funny to think about, because Epsilon was never supposed to be the final limit of osumania. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of impossible. But once Epsilon was clear, there was something even more ridiculous sitting above it. Zeta. Now, the Mythical's original Zeta was basically a meme, and I think we can safely say that. The first map is so ridiculous, and I think only a few people can pass it without using rake tapping or double setup. The second map was, well, something. The third one, I don't even know what to say about it. And the fourth map is literally a compilation of all the stamina maps from Fearsden all the way to Epsilon. So, it didn't really work as a way to measure skill anymore. It's less of a progression step and more of a silly curse sitting above everything else. So no, that wasn't the direction the evolution of raw skill was going to take. Instead, it went somewhere else. Between 2019 and 2020, an important piece of osumania history appeared. Emek, someone I appreciate a lot in my own osumania journey, created a website that still preserves all of the DD mythical tank curses today. And alongside that, he created what became known as the 4th pack, which contains a new fan-made version of Zeta and 3 versions of Epsilon maps. And just like Epsilon before it, the Zeta wasn't really supposed to be cleared. But at that point, something similar to Epsilon was obviously going to happen eventually. Because, think about it, if Epsilon used to be a joke and someone cleared it, then what about Zeta? Surprisingly, it actually felt possible. Unlike Epsilon, the first 3 maps weren't really the main problem. They were hard, obviously, but compared to what came after, they were manageable. Because Zeta had one real wall, the final map, Angel Dust. Something about Angel Dust is interesting because it's a map that sits at an evil 340 BPM with many parts at both 3 players and make the drop accuracy. This is the main reason for drops in runs, and it's very evil because it is literally the final map of the entire curse. And here's where we introduce one of the most legendary players on this side, Kane Mining. Kane Mining, despite his relatively short stay in the osumania community, left a massive mark on raw skill before disappearing from the scene around 2023. Because honestly, he just didn't care. In 2021, he reached rank number 1 before eventually being banned from the game for reasons I honestly don't remember that well. You can leave a comment if you remember. But more importantly for this story, he became one of the players who pushed Zeta the hardest. During that era, I don't remember many people seriously attempting my clear. It was K Mining really who put the most effort into it. On January 17th, 2022, he uploaded one of his first major Zeta progress videos to his YouTube channel, a 94.87% run, and it was already incredibly solid. He entered the final map with a 95.3% and barely dropped anything from there, so at that point, we already knew Zeta was going to fall eventually. On his channel, there were also two other extremely important scores. His first clear on the Jack map with the 96.2% and a rest rank on the Tech map. So, with all that progress building up, on June 1st, 2022, he uploaded the first documented S rank on the full Zeta course. He cleared the Jack map, held an S rank through the rest of the course, and suddenly, Zeta no longer felt like a meme, it felt real. And then, on July 27, 2022, Zeta was finally cleared. After months of pushing, K Mining achieved a run that was completely unprecedented. 97% on the Jack map and 97% after the Tech map, and by the time he reached the final map, he was sitting comfortable at 96.95% score. At that point, the clear was in his hands. It all depended on Angel Dust, and somehow he held on. He finished the course with a 96.38%. Zeta had been cleared. Once again, something that was never supposed to be possible stopped being impossible, and the question became the same one as before. What now? Because the thing we had defined as impossible at the beginning of the arc wasn't impossible anymore. The community looked like it had no limits. After that, I will eventually get the second Zeta clear, and today, there are more than 15 documented Zeta clears. So naturally, the next question was obvious. What comes after Zeta? But before we answer that, there's something I haven't told you yet. Eta didn't appear after Zeta was cleared. In fact, it had been there for a long time. Just a few days after my Epsilon clear, on April 25th, Palmiel submitted the Dan Reform final set, which included both Zeta and Eta, and right from the beginning, the map itself basically told you what kind of challenge this was supposed to be. These dance are not intended for humans. That warning wasn't even that exaggerated. Eta was absurd. Not just because it was hard, but because some parts pushed so far into the physical side of the game that players admittedly started questioning whether it was actually testing skill or just testing vibro. One of the most important pieces of feedback came from Jaxu, who pointed out that some sections had too much vibro, especially the long jump through patterns in Eta, and this actually mattered because Palmiel responded to that feedback and started adjusting the pack. Zeta was remapped first, and Eta will also receive changes later. So, unlike the Mythical's original Zeta, which was basically a meme, Palmiel's Zeta slowly became something different. It wasn't so ridiculous. It was so far beyond what almost anyone could play, but over time, it became less of a joke and more of a real challenge. By 2022, the course had become much better structured, and a lot of players even preferred it over Zeta because it felt more balanced. But even then, Eta had a strange place in the community. People knew it existed, but almost nobody treated it like something that was actually going to be cleared, and that's what made it so interesting. Because Epsilon started as a joke, and it eventually fell. Zeta started as a joke, and eventually fell too. So at some point, the question became impossible to ignore. What about Eta? And around late 2023, I decided to seriously test that question myself. Some people in my chat had already talked to me about Eta before, but it wasn't until October 2023 that I actually started seeing real progress on that. This was around the time where I was getting some of my strongest peaks as a player, and aside from Saragi, who at that point wasn't even close to the monster he is today, I was showing some of the most promising progress in the course. I started getting scores like what I believe was the first documented dust rank on Collapse of Ego, which is the easiest map out of the 4, followed by Charm and Payback, a 217 BPM Jack third map that serves as the first map of the course. Then, around November, I started getting my best scores on Eta up that point, including progress in Eta Tech, which can feel extremely RNG at times. But the funny thing is that I never actually tried the full time. Not even once! And you may be wondering why. I had already cleared Epsilon, and had already cleared Zeta. So why didn't I try Eta? Well, the answer is simple. We were back in the same cycle again. Intercept, Thunderbolt. The speed map was the real problem. Just like Mario painted was the wall of Epsilon, and Angel Dust was the wall of Zeta, Eta had its own final obstacle. And for me, Intercept was that obstacle. On top of that, my interest in the game started dropping a lot to the 2024. So, we will never really know if I could have gotten an S-rank on Eta if I had kept playing seriously. But someone else did keep playing. Saragi. During most of 2024, Saragi dedicated a huge part of his sessions to Eta, because he saw the same thing that some of us had seen years before. He didn't just see an impossible then, he saw a real goal. Up until 2024, Saragi was still using a mechanical keyboard, and even then, he started surpassing many of the personal bests I had set before. He became the first player to achieve a 96% on Collapse of Ego, and once he switched to a magnetic keyboard, his progress became exponential. In June 2024, he achieved an S-rank on Eta speed 0.95% with 95.3%. After that, his progress kept accelerating. He even started upgrading Collapse of Ego to 105, and eventually obtained the first documented S-rank on the hardest map in Eta then, Intercept. At that point, Saragi had become the chosen one, player most likely to become the first person to clear Eta, but he wasn't the only one pushing the curse. CRC Boo was also in the race, and in August 2024, he achieved the first documented S-rank on the full Eta then, although with pauses. The run ended at a 94.2%, with individual map scores 94.87%, 94.74, 94.85, and 95.2. It wasn't a valid clear, but it proved something important. Eta wasn't just a fantasy anymore. The course could be held together. And then, near the end of 2024, the final wall finally broke. On December 19th, 2024, Saragi cleared Eta then.
I just need to hold. I just need to hold. That's all what I need. What? 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 Oh, what? I did it! I did it! What the fuck? Oh.
The last mirror that in the physical raw skill lineage of osumania had already fallen. And once again, something that was literally described as not intended for humans had been defeated by one. There's something funny about this story. It was never only about the dance. It was always a story of a community told through its players. Epsilon, Zeta, and Eta are probably some of the clearest and easiest ways to show the evolution of raw skill in osumania. But obviously, they are not the only examples. While these stats were being pushed year after year, osumania was evolving alongside them. So, I asked a simple question on Twitter: what was something you once considered impossible? And the answers were all over the place. Some people thought the impossible was an Epsilon clear. For others, it was an Epsilon architecture, which yeah, I honestly agree with. Some remembered Chili's Fingers 93% on Epsilon as Steve Trupik, while others mentioned Wonder's Double S on AI, and 99% on Blue Zenith in Gene Dimensions difficulty in 7 key, a Galaxy Collapse Double S, milestones like 900 PP and 1k PP in 4 key. And none of these answers had something in common. Here are the echoes of how people in this community watch the impossible become possible. Every player, depending on when they started, had their own vision of what impossible looked like. If you started in one era, Epsilon probably looked impossible to you. If you started later, maybe you already took Epsilon for granted, but Zeta looked impossible instead. If you follow PP milestones, maybe it wasn't 900 PP. If you cared about accuracy, scores on maps like the Empress, Aya, or Galactic Collapse probably looked ridiculous. The point is that osumania and BSRGs doesn't evolve in one straight line, it evolves in many different directions at the same time, and each one moves at its own pace. Titans kept getting pushed farther, with more raids and harder goals. That's why today, we can even think about things like Gamma DT, Beta DT, Tachyon 1.35, and so many other raids that will have sounded completely ridiculous years ago. We can think about DT scores on maps like Aya that now have S ranks, when back then, a Tank's A rank already felt like something unreal. The community today keeps switching score stat in their own era, probably shouldn't have even existed in someone's imagination. And that's the interesting part. The things people once described as impossible eventually became part of the game. They became part of its history, and slowly they have turned osumania into what it is today. Even though these achievements are still incredible, the community evolved past them. People started seeing them as benchmarks, as references, and eventually, almost as routine. And that is what makes osumania so ridiculous to me. Every generation had its own impossible, and every generation eventually watched that impossible break, and that cycle is probably going to keep going. Who knows what the future will bring? There are still so many promising players, so many people pushing the limits, and as long as there is still that spark, that competition, and that desire to go further, we will keep watching something new get broken every single day.
Holy shit, look this, look